In the first year of Onin, the country was greatly disturbed, and for a long time thereafter, the 5 inner provinces and the 7 regions were all in turmoil. The fault lay with his lordship, the shogun Yoshimasa, who was the 7th ruler from Takauji. Instead of entrusting the affairs of the country to his worthy ministers, Yoshimasa governed solely by the wishes of inexperienced wives and nuns. Yet these women did not know the difference between right and wrong and were ignorant of public affairs and the government. Both court noble and warrior were steeped in luxury, as were the people in the city and even those in distant provinces. The opulence of the great houses and the suffering of the masses were beyond description. Thus the masses were anguished and distressed, and they cried out as did the people of Jia, who resented the outrages of King Jie. Who will perish today? Perhaps it will be you and I. If there were loyal subjects at this time, why did they not come forth with remonstrances? On the contrary, their attitude was, let the country break asunder if it is going to break, or let society perish if it is going to perish. People sought only wealth and honors so that they could disport themselves in a manner more brilliant than others. Heaven had already displayed omens portending a great disturbance. At about 10 in the evening, on the 13th day of the 9th month of 1465, a brilliant object streaked across the sky from southwest to northeast. Heaven and earth rumbled, and it seemed as though the universe would suddenly break and the world would be torn asunder. It was dreadful. In China, when the Zhou dynasty was about to collapse, a comet appeared in the sky to mark a decline in the rites of the 7 ancestral temples. People knew in their hearts that the house of Zhou was falling, but there was no one to speak out. And in the case of our own country, how strange it was that at the same hour of the same day in the following year, the object flew back to its original place. According to one story, it was a Tengu shooting star. The Onin War, one of Japan's most significant conflicts, fought from 1467 to 1477, has been often credited as being the true start of the warring Sengoku period. It was truly a devastating affair that not only left the imperial capital Kyoto in ash and ruin, further destabilizing the Muromachi Bakufu, but also spreading deep into the countryside as families took up arms to destroy their rivals. Over the years, there have emerged misconceptions and recontextualizations of this conflict, as historians have tried to sift through what we know to be true and false. Yet within these investigations, one surprising fact has remained: that people in Japan, prior to the start of the Onin War, seem to have prophesized its coming. Much of what we are about to cover is brilliantly detailed in a fascinating article published by historian Thomas Conlan in the Journal of Japanese Studies back in 2020, titled The Onin War as the Fulfillment of Prophecy. Now, the notion that the disastrous state of affairs that Japan found itself in at that time was all leading to an eventual reckoning does not necessarily need to have been mystically prophesized. The writing might have been already on the wall. Violence was an increasingly frequent occurrence in pre-modern Japan. Thus, with the deterioration of central authority and the rise in autonomy of warrior leaders, such a conclusion that a greater age of war was on the horizon might not have been a surprising thought. Yet, belief in prophecies themselves were something the people of Japan often subscribed to. They believed in the spiritual or cosmic forces that could potentially influence their day-to-day lives or long-term fate, or at the very least, explain what was happening. Thus, when coincidences began to align, such a conclusion was easily believed. This begs a number of important questions, though. For one, what were the driving factors behind why such an earth-shattering war was foreseen? And two, in what ways did the actual scope of such a conflict live up to the disaster which had been envisioned? In answering these questions, it is logical that we should perhaps go back in time and start with the decline of the Muromachi Bakufu itself. The Ashikaga had ruled since 1336, with their power being further cemented 2 years later by Ashikaga Takauji being granted the title of shogun. Unfortunately, Takauji did not take authority over a peaceful nation. Instead, he was still invested into a bitter power struggle between himself, the de facto leader of the warrior class, and that of the former Emperor Go-Daigo, who had fled south to establish a rival imperial court in Nara. This had begun the Nanbokucho, a period of violence across the country as clans rose up to support one side over the other. Such a chaotic age immediately had begun to erode Ashikaga influence, as powerful shugo, military land governors, in the countryside began arising, commanding significant local influence. It was the coming dawn of the daimyo houses. By 1392, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun of the Muromachi Bakufu, managed to reconcile the competing courts and bring an end to the Nanbokucho, and for a moment stability reigned under a prominent Ashikaga leader. Yet, the golden age of the Ashikaga was not to last. The future generations would be faced with increasing hardship and declining authority. Competition, even with the Bakufu, was starting to emerge, especially seen by the mighty Ochi clan of the west, whose own impressive power threatened that of the Ashikaga shoguns. The situation began to spiral further into distress by the coming of Yoshimitsu's third son, Yoshinori. Yoshinori, who became shogun in 1428, attempted to build back the might of the Bakufu, which had started to wane. His policies were that of consolidating his own direct power, while also forming a greater army solely loyal to the Bakufu, in aims to reduce the reliance there had been on the other allied shugo. Yoshinori's radical agenda eventually saw him assassinated by 1441. He would not be the last Ashikaga shogun to suffer such a fate. Following Yoshinori, his son Yoshikatsu would rule as a child briefly until he too died in 1443. Finally then ushering in the reign of the next in line, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, who would rule throughout the opening of the Onin War, and who historians and other storytellers have often blamed for the start of the conflict. The characterization of Yoshimasa, which has emerged over the centuries, often portrayed him as someone disinterested in rule, someone who was much more interested in the art and culture of the capital, and not with governing the warrior class. We even heard this from the earlier passage read from the Chronicle of Onin, which blamed Yoshimasa for the disaster that was to come. However, recent studies have indicated that Yoshimasa was in fact quite interested in his role and had done much in an attempt to strengthen his position. This is just one of the many ways that the Oninki, or the Chronicle of Onin, has twisted the narrative. As historian Thomas Conlan describes, Japanese scholarship has also revealed that the Oninki narrative of the politics leading up to the war is misleading. Momose Kisao emphasizes that Ashikaga Yoshimasa's attempt to centralize his rule led to the war and the ultimate Ashikaga implosion. Since publication of Momose's article, the idea that Yoshimasa was a shogun who strove to rule directly and forcefully has become more widely accepted. There were of course many actors in the drama that had been unfolding, from the powerful Ochi in the west and their Yamana allies to the influential Hosokawa, as well as two competing branches of the Hatakeyama and others. The situation was far from clearly defined. For so long, we've been led to believe that Yoshimasa had shied away from his duties and allowed the chaos to engulf the country, when in reality it would seem much more accurate to say that Yoshimasa had been attempting for some time to restore the authority of the Ashikaga, like his father Yoshinori had also attempted. So then, if the situation was far more complex than we had previously thought, what would indicate the true start of the conflict? This appears to be a matter that historians have been debating for some time. Once again, our common understanding is that the war broke out with the Ashikaga succession dispute following Yoshimasa's desire to retire, and thus resulting in two competing camps of the Yamana and Hosokawa. Because of our expanding understanding of the tumultuous period in which Japan found itself in at this time, some historians have instead argued that the conflict could have begun earlier. Conlan, for example, argues that the war began as early as 1465, 2 years before our popular understanding of the war starting in 1467. Conlan, for instance, points to the Ashikaga campaigns against the Ochi in the west as the true start of war. Yet this is precisely what makes the topic all the more intriguing, as the true nature of the larger conflict which has unfolded has been altered. Instead, the Ochi have been largely sidelined in favor of propping up the heated rivalry between Yamana Sozin and Hosokawa Katsumoto. In reality, the eruption of war in the capital, it would seem, was not the true start of any period of war, but perhaps the last straw, which collapsed the system, and as we know, left Kyoto in ruins, helping to further diminish shogunal authority. It was certainly the doom that had been foreseen in prior prophecies of the time. But what were these prophecies? How did they emerge and come to influence the minds of everyday people? Well, to start, our understanding of a prophecy being considered comes from the Oninki, as, like I read at the start of the video, a comet was seen as a terrible omen for a disaster that was to come. However, as we have already suggested, the Oninki itself is not reliable. Not only was it written decades after the end of the conflict, there also exists different versions of the text, some being multiple volumes long, as in later years additional information was added to fill gaps and fix what were seen as prior errors. As Conlan states, the shortcomings of the original version of the Oninki as a narrative of the conflict were so pronounced that in later centuries it was expanded from 1 to 3 volumes to cover the latter years of the war. The prophecy, however, no longer held much interest and was omitted and forgotten, and its influence in determining literary and historical narratives was largely ignored. Prophecies themselves, foretold by oracles and recorded into poetic formats, have a deep history in Japan, yet their prominence came and went. As we have discussed, people turned to them during uncertain times as a way to explain current events and understand what fate may eventually arise. In many instances, they were used to even gain political legitimacy. By the 15th century, such prophecies were becoming frequent in conversation. 2 particular prophecies, both hundreds of years old, began to be considered as potentially revealing the chaotic nature of the period and the eventual disaster that would come. First was that of the Miraiki, a prophecy which first appeared during the 12th century. The Miraiki was a common prophecy considered throughout the 1400s, as much of what was said within it remained somewhat true, with one of its most prominent features being fortellings of Gekkokujo, the lower toppling the higher. The Miraiki had gained increased prominence due to its consideration following the fall of the old Kamakura Bakufu. Its mention can even be found in certain versions of the Taiheki, the epic text that detailed events throughout the fall of the Kamakura Bakufu, rise of the Emperor Go-Daigo, and the warring years to come. And now, opposing factions on various sides of this new brewing conflict had begun to invest themselves into the Miraiki as a way of justifying their own position. The Miraiki itself would have likely remained the dominant prophecy considered throughout the period, were it not perhaps for one fateful event which opened the door to a much older prophecy being reconsidered. By 1456, a certain comet, which we now today refer to as Halley's Comet, streaked across the night sky. Seen by people around the world, records indicate its size during this encounter was larger than usual due to its closeness to the Earth. In Japan, monks gathered to discuss what it could potentially mean. Their thoughts came back to a prophecy which had originated several hundred years even before the Miraiki. This was that of a prophecy known as the Yamataishi. The Yamataishi foretold the coming of a great doom, the end of Japan's imperial family, and the complete decay of social order, often imagined as dogs fighting with monkeys. It was marked by the arrival of great comets blazing forth from the heavens, or rats gnawing at the innards of dead oxen, another sight which supposedly was witnessed and recorded, adding more legitimacy to the coming of the Yamataishi prophecy. However, the strange event of an arriving comet did not just happen once, but as we know, another comet came nearly a decade later, in 1465. This one, a Tengu star, came so close to Earth it is said to have emitted a sound. Horror must have gripped the minds of people, and with the dawning of war, some even came to alter the Miraiki to instead include elements of the Yamataishi prophecy. What might have made the arrival of this comet all the more foreboding was that it came at a time when the factions which would take part in the Onin War were beginning to form. It was here Ashikaga Yoshimasa was contending with that of the influential Ochi Norihiro, going so far as to confiscate the prominent port of Tosai in western Honshu, and causing Norihiro to retaliate militarily. Yet, Norihiro would die suddenly, 10 days before the comet's arrival, and with the emergence of war between the great powers of the Ashikaga and Ochi, some saw the Tengu star as an indicator of the coming doom. Norihiro's son, Ochi Masahiro, would continue his father's efforts against the Ashikaga. Thus, the Onin War might really be better described as a conflict between Ashikaga Yoshimasa and Ochi Masahiro, and not that of the popular figures of Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sozen, who would enter the fray later. In this sense, the war instead was a clash of influence, as the Ochi, through Yamana and Hatakeyama allies, contended against rivals seeking power. For instance, the conflict between Hatakeyama Masanaga and Yoshinari, which threatened to upset the order in the east. While Yoshimasa had backed Masanaga, it would be the Ochi-backed Yoshinari who would come out on top. Yoshimasa's efforts were failing, and bloodshed in the east and in the west was on the rise, not for lack of his own attempts to put an end to the chaos. Such an understanding of a more proactive Yoshimasa certainly shifts our view of him, from prior stories portraying him as disinterested in his position and more attracted to the art and culture of the capital. It appears as though much more of the demonizing of Yoshimasa came in later years, as writers of the Oninki sought to shift narratives, removing the significance of his war with the Ochi and instead making him look weak and ineffective. Some historians, such as Mary Elizabeth Berry, concede that he had both strong and weak policy, but that such demeanor made him instead appear as more of that of a weather vane, rather than a competent leader. Now, Yoshimasa might have been considering retirement, perhaps as early as 1464, bearing in mind that a retired shogun still held considerable influence. Yet, little did he likely expect that even leaving the official position of shogun would lead to further struggle. As we know, the popular story of the Onin War begins with this crisis, as the issue of Yoshimasa's successor is what caused the powerful Yamana and Hosokawa to leap at each other's throats, leading to war erupting in Kyoto, while conflict had already been felt far and wide. Perhaps it was this horror of the war in the capital which caused people to truly believe the prophecy had come true. Yoshimasa would not retire until 1473, yet he would still remain prominent in political discourse, eventually coming to terms with his rival Ochi Masahiro, returning Masahiro's confiscated lands in the west in return for the removal of Ochi forces from the central region. As such, one might judge the Ochi as the true victors of the Onin War. Masahiro's settlement with Yoshimasa, a clear indicator of his triumph over the Ashikaga. Popular history, on the other hand, doesn't like to frame a victor of the war, instead leaving the conflict as open as the chaos the period resembled. For many, we now see Japan as having entered the age of the country at war, the Sengoku period. There, Ashikaga authority had been reduced so far that provincial military leaders felt free to act autonomously to expand their own influence. Why Masahiro's victory is not seen as more complete today is largely thanks to perhaps two significant factors. One being the shifting narrative of the Oninki, which changed the focus of the conflict to that of the Hosokawa and Yamana, while discrediting Yoshimasa. Later versions of the Oninki even went so far as to diminish the role of prophecies as central to the feelings which predated the outbreak of war. On the other hand, the collapse of central authority felt by the war also certainly could be said to have played a factor in forgetting the success of the Ochi, For although Masahiro had emerged successful, the victory he won could perhaps be argued as more detrimental to the state than anything else, as it further weakened what influence remained within the Muromachi Bakufu. Prophecies such as the Miraiki and more importantly Yamataishi foretold the collapse of social order through the rise of Gekkokujo. And although the doom they projected did not end the world as some might have feared, or at the very least even end the imperial line, still, Japan was entering into a new and more unstable era, a nation torn asunder and requiring the eventual emergence of those who have been dubbed the Great Unifiers to piece it back together. To this effect, one could speculate that perhaps some semblance of the prophecies had come true in the end. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.